here with
Edward Ware,
composer of
conceptualist really in this case, of a couple of albums addressing a small part of the legacy of Shostakovich.
which are
Taking Shostakovich Out, and more recently Shadows of Shostakovich.
both available on.
Bandcamp, edwardware.bandcamp.com.
Great. So let's get started. Tell me a little bit about the idea behind Shadows of Shostakovich.
Well, I've always been a fan, I guess you would say, of Shostakovich's music, but as a drum set player, there's not a lot of scope for actually playing it, as you can imagine. So a number of years ago, when I was doing a composition degree, I got into his preludes and fugues. When you're seriously studying music, you inevitably get deeply into Bach's fugues and preludes, and Shostakovich had a really interesting take on that whole idea, and it sat with me. I brought the piano music and kind of, picked my way through it, and it's interesting to see how he was in this in-between space, but with tonality and extended ideas of what key centers he was in and so on. And the whole notion of fugue is very interesting in terms of this inversion of an idea, and that's something that drummers can often play with, putting things between bass drum and snare drum and floor tom and then inverting them. So I thought, oh, well, that's interesting, I could do something with that. So I did the first album, Taking Shostakovich Out, based on the fugues. And then I thought, well, I did it with a saxophone player, Chris Kelsey, and it's relatively rhythmically inspired and driven that way. And then I thought, well, it would be nice to do something perhaps a little more coloristic and dealing with the preludes, which are arguably a more open format. And then I thought a guitar would be great to do that with. I've often done playing with just drums and guitar. And then long story short, the guy who was originally going to do the session couldn't do it. And I got in touch with Javier Valdez, who turned out to be a perfect guy for the gig, wonderful player, beautifully musical, very sensitive. So we got into the studio and made the record.
And in terms of composition to
improvisation?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, basically it's taking very much with the Shadows record, Shadows of Shostakovich. It's really that idea of a shadow. We're taking the mood and the ideas, not strictly the material as written every time, and extemporizing on that. So they're very open approaches to the mood and the feeling that he seems to be evoking in those works.
Mm-hmm. And you've talked sort of about using visual input as a source of inspiration. In this case, was it only the sound of his composition and his music, or was there anything about sort of his historical context that was relevant?
Well, that's
to the
something that's a great question. Something that's interesting for me about Shostakovich as a figure in 20th century music is the environment he was living in politically in Russia, and what that meant for the interpretation of his music, how it was heard, how it was understood, and what the authorities felt was acceptable and what wasn't. And it had a very direct life or death impact. Often for a lot of his friends were killed and sent to the Gulag. So that he kept writing and creating under those sort of circumstances, I've always found very admirable and inspiring, and that was part of what drew me into wanting to find a way of exploring what idea and context mean and how they interact with each other. And that was very much what was going on with the Taking Shostakovich Out record, was to take him out, the idea of taking him out of Russia, taking his ideas out of a classical kind of context and dealing with a drum set. This is a very curious idea to me. What is it that gives meaning to our ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So this is kind of, both the records in this way are exploration of common raw materials that can be looked at from a different context and teach us something innate to the idea that can be overlooked. So we're exploring that process.
Speaking of, I just wanted to comment on how unusual it is, such a combination of instruments, and how I feel like that can make something sound quite abstracted in terms of sonic ideas. I was wondering if you had any sort of structure to the way you approach this, or if you would have any structure that you would want people, or any principles that you want people to keep in mind when listening to this music.
No principles to keep in mind really, but it's an interesting question in terms of approaching a project like this, because there are certain ideas. You look at these 48 pieces. He wrote them in 3 months, which is extraordinary. But there's certain things that will lay well on an instrument like the drums. You could hear certain repeating eighth note figures that I could put that on the tom-toms with the mallets, and then a melodic line can be freely laid across that with the guitar. Other things were so strongly harmonic and at tempos that wouldn't have been easily transferred to the drums. It wouldn't have made sense. So I did look through the pieces, play them a little at the piano, and figure out what would work in terms of a relatively limited palette. But of course it turns out Harvey has all sorts of other ideas and tricks up his sleeve, if you will, with pedals and repeating things and sonic landscapes that he can create. So it really freed me up as a drummer, not to just to have to play time. There's a very textural approach to the material from both of us, which is wonderful and quite liberating to approach the drums more pianistically and coloristically and sort of orchestrally, really. I played in the youth orchestra when I was a kid and sort of come at it a little bit from that background, not just a groove thing.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like you really sort of rediscovered some of Shostakovich's music. Is there any sort of special insight that you gain into his sound world or into the drums particularly, or you think Harvey may have discovered something new about himself through this process of abstraction?
I'd have to speak to Harvey about that, but there's definitely a sense that there's a fullness in the sound we create together that I think comes from the strength of Shostakovich's ideas. There's certain intervallic relationships, directional impulses that are very easy to latch onto. It's you notice that in certain jazz composers too, people like Thelonious Monk. They're short, skeletal ideas, but they're robust and they're good material for extemporization. And I think there's something of that strong character in Shostakovich. When you think of his life and what he had to deal with in terms of external forces, to have the force of character to still move through that and create, it's it's Beethoven in this way of insistence and presence. But yet what's interesting is it's malleable. We can still take it into this century and use electric instruments and a drum set and create something really beautiful out of it. So I really find that an inspiring thing too, to realize that there's still something new in what we think we know. And again, that comes back to my feeling with art, that it should be encouraging us to find out something about ourselves and our experience of being in the world. And music for me is a vehicle for that, in the same way that great visual art is, that great sculpture is. It's not just a mild entertainment in the background.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Any last comments or final
No,
words?
please go to Bandcamp and explore the record.
Great. Anywhere we can find you?
You can find me at madlabmusic.com, see some of the other projects I'm involved with, or again, edwardware.bandcamp.com to buy the record. Thanks again for listening.